Krogar the Unbreakable. His name alone sent ripples of fear across entire galaxies. A towering, four-armed juggernaut of muscle and brutality, forged in countless arenas, undefeated, indomitable. For years, he stood as the epitome of strength, the champion of champions. His people, the Turlak, held strength above all else. Weakness was unforgivable. Utility was all that mattered. To them, Krogar was more than just a gladiator. He was their greatest symbol of power, until he wasn't. The arena where Krogar had built his legacy was vast, filled with cold, unfeeling eyes that watched only for blood and victory. Every match was a spectacle of violence, a fight for survival where only the strongest could walk away. The crowd loved him when he stood tall, undefeated, but now, as the dust settled around his broken body, they watched in silence, the cold anticipation of a predator sensing the end of its prey. His opponent was a mysterious new challenger, fast, relentless, and cunning. Krogar, despite his years of dominance, had underestimated the creature's agility. Blow after blow landed faster than he could counter. And then it happened. A sickening crack echoed through the arena as Krogar's knee buckled under a savage strike. His forearms, once symbols of his unmatched strength, now hung limp and bloody by his sides. The final blow struck him across the face, sending him crashing to the ground in a heap of dust and defeat. His reign as champion was over. In his mind, the arena went quiet. The once roaring crowd became distant noise. Pain surged through every part of him, but worse than the physical agony was the sense of failure creeping into his thoughts. He had never fallen before. His body lay broken, and in his culture, a broken warrior was as good as dead. He could feel it in the air, the anticipation of abandonment. The cold truth of the Turlak. He tried to move, but his legs betrayed him. Blood pooled beneath his massive frame. He scanned the faces of his fellow Turlak in the stands, expecting something: anger, disgust, maybe even a glimmer of concern. But there was nothing. No one rushed to his side. Not a single ally moved to help. They stood, arms crossed, eyes devoid of any emotion. To them, Krogar was no longer useful. He was a discarded tool, a warrior whose time had come to an end. Slowly, they turned their backs on him, one by one. The champions of his people, those who had once cheered for his victories, now saw nothing in him. They had no room for weakness. No room for mercy. Krogar had been invincible, but invincibility had its price. When you fall alone. As his vision blurred, he felt the full weight of his betrayal sinking in. This was the Turlak way: strength or death. He had given everything to his people, bled for their approval, fought for their honor, and now, they cast him aside without a second thought. It was in that moment, lying in the dust of the arena he had once ruled, that Krogar began to question everything he had believed in. His pride kept him from acknowledging it fully, but deep down, something had shattered. He had been bred to think strength was the only path to survival, that anything less than perfection was a sign of weakness. But now, broken and abandoned, he realized the Turlak's so-called strength was nothing more than a cold facade. Their loyalty was fleeting, their respect conditional, and their love non-existent. Krogar lay in silence, his body heavy with pain, his mind clouded with questions. For the first time in his life, the unbreakable had been broken. And no one cared. The human rebels operated in the shadows, a ragtag group fighting a war they knew they were unlikely to win. For them, it was never about victory. It was about survival, about holding on to the small flickers of freedom in a galaxy dominated by the cold fist of the Galactic Empire. Hidden on a remote planet, their base was nothing more than a network of old tunnels and ruins, but it had been enough to keep them out of the Empire's reach, at least for now. Captain Alex Reynolds, a veteran soldier who had long since stopped believing in grand victories, led this group. His face was lined with the weight of decisions made in desperation. Next to him, Dr. Elena Foster, sharp-eyed and brilliant, handled the tech and medical side of the rebellion. Together, they had forged a small but capable force of fighters, engineers, and survivors, all united by a shared hatred for the empire that had crushed so many. The rebels knew they were fighting a losing battle. The Empire's reach was long, its resources seemingly infinite, and every year, more colonies fell under its oppressive control. The humans had no illusions of overthrowing the Empire outright, but they aimed to disrupt, to carve out spaces of resistance where the Empire's influence would falter, even if just for a moment. It was during a mission to scavenge supplies after a brutal tournament that they stumbled upon something none of them had expected. Reynolds and his team had been scouring the aftermath of the event, picking through wreckage and debris, hoping to find anything useful. That's when they found Krogar, the fallen gladiator, lying on the cold, hard ground, barely clinging to life. At first, they didn't recognize him. He was just another body among the many left behind. But as they approached, the sheer size of the figure made them stop. It wasn't until they were closer that they realized who or what he was. Krogar, the famed alien warrior, known across the stars for his brutality, now lay broken and bleeding in front of them. There was a moment of hesitation. Krogar had been an enemy, a figure that had stood for everything the rebels fought against, a symbol of the strength that kept the Empire in power. And yet, here he was, abandoned, left for dead by his own people. It wasn't surprising. The Turlac valued strength above all else. To them, a wounded gladiator had no more value than scrap metal. Reynolds and his team exchanged looks. It would be easy to leave him. They had no reason to help, and frankly, many would argue that letting him die would be the smarter choice. After all, the gladiator had spent his life killing for the amusement of the galaxy's elites. But something held Reynolds back. He stared down at Krogar, seeing not the champion everyone feared, but the vulnerability in his broken body. There was something about the sight of such a formidable creature abandoned by those who had once cheered for him. And in that moment, Reynolds made his decision. They would save him. The rest of the team was shocked. There were objections, of course. Dr. Foster, ever pragmatic, questioned the logic of saving an enemy. Others pointed out that Krogar had no reason to be loyal to them. But Reynolds wasn't moved by logic. For him, it was about something deeper, something that separated them from the cold ruthlessness of the Empire and the Turlac. Krogar wasn't a tool to be discarded. He was alive, and that was enough. Against all odds, the decision was made. They worked quickly, patching Krogar up as best they could on the field, then transporting him back to their base. It wasn't easy. The gladiator was massive, and they were few. But through sheer determination, they managed to get him back to the safety of their hidden base. Krogar was disoriented when he regained consciousness. His mind, still clouded by pain, couldn't grasp why he was still alive, let alone why these weak, fragile humans had gone out of their way to save him. They were beneath him, at least that's what he had always believed. In the arena, humans were nothing more than a spectacle, easy prey for the stronger species. Yet here they were, tending to his wounds, whispering words of care that made no sense to him. At first, his instincts told him to fight, to lash out. He had always survived by his strength, and his strength had always been his weapon. But as he tried to move, his body refused to cooperate. He was too weak, too broken. For the first time in his life, Krogar couldn't rely on his power. The humans worked quietly around him. Their movements were gentle, careful, almost compassionate. It was an alien concept to him. His own people would never have done this. He couldn't understand it, couldn't fathom why anyone would help a creature as broken as he was. These humans, these insignificant creatures, had every reason to leave him behind. They had nothing to gain from saving him. As the pain began to dull and his mind cleared, Krogar's confusion deepened. He didn't trust them. He couldn't. He had been raised to believe that trust was a weakness, that loyalty was earned through strength, not compassion. But here, in this cold, dark hideout, surrounded by those he had once seen as lesser, Krogar was forced to confront a reality he had never considered before. These humans were different. And for the first time, Krogar wondered if perhaps they were stronger than he had ever given them credit for. Krogar's recovery was slow, almost agonizingly so. For someone who had spent his life at the pinnacle of physical strength, the helplessness was a crushing weight. Every breath was a reminder of his frailty, every movement a battle against pain. Yet, despite his injuries, the humans never gave up on him. Dr. Elena Foster worked tirelessly, her hands moving with practiced precision as she applied human medicine and advanced tech to stabilize his condition. At first, Krogar was silent, watching them with suspicion, unsure of their motives. Trust didn't come easily to him, not after what his own people had done. He refused to show weakness, even though it was clear he could do nothing for himself. His pride stung at the thought of relying on creatures he had once considered beneath him. But as the days passed, the humans' persistence was impossible to ignore. They cared for him without hesitation, even when he remained distant and uncooperative. Elena especially was relentless, always returning to check his wounds, adjusting her techniques, pushing her limited resources to their limits. Despite his silent defiance, Krogar couldn't deny the skill with which they worked. They had a resilience, a stubbornness that rivaled even his own, and it intrigued him. It was during those long stretches of recovery that Krogar began to observe the humans more closely. Their base was small, a far cry from the luxurious strongholds of the Turlak. The rebels lived on the edge, scavenging for supplies, repairing old technology with whatever they could find, but they made it work. Every day, they gathered to share meals, to plan their next move, to help one another with tasks. It was a stark contrast to the life Krogar had known. In the Turlak culture, strength was a solitary endeavor. You fought alone, and if you fell alone. But these humans, they fought together. They weren't the physically strongest species, but they had something his people lacked: loyalty to one another. It was clear in their actions, in the way they looked out for each other. It was an alien concept to Krogar, and it unsettled him. One day, as Elena was checking his wounds, Krogar asked her why they were helping him. It wasn't a question of curiosity, it was more an accusation. He didn't understand why they would waste time on someone who, by all rights, should be their enemy. Her answer was simple, almost too simple for him to grasp at first. Because that's what we do. We don't leave people behind. Her words lingered with him, gnawing at the edges of his rigid beliefs. Loyalty, compassion, these were weaknesses in the Turlak way. But here, among these humans, they were strengths. The more he watched them, the more he began to understand that their survival wasn't just based on individual power, but on their ability to rely on one another. It was a kind of strength he had never been taught to value. In his quiet moments, Krogar couldn't help but reflect on the stark contrast between these humans and his own people. The Turlak had abandoned him the moment he was no longer useful. To them, his worth had ended the second he fell in the arena. But the humans, these fragile, soft creatures, had saved him, even when they had nothing to gain from it. They had no reason to trust him, and yet they had offered him a second chance. It was a bitter pill to swallow. His entire life had been built around the idea that strength was everything. He had been conditioned to believe that weakness deserved nothing but contempt. And yet, here he was, alive because these humans had chosen to defy that belief. Their compassion was a force he hadn't understood, and it unsettled him. As the days turned into weeks, Krogar's body began to heal. He could feel his strength returning, slowly but surely, though it was far from what it had once been. But alongside the physical recovery came something else, a growing sense of connection to these humans. It wasn't loyalty, not yet, but there was something there, something he couldn't quite define. He watched them every day, their struggles and their triumphs. They fought against overwhelming odds, but they fought together. They shared their food, their resources, their time. They laughed, despite the darkness that surrounded them. Krogar had never seen anything like it. And as much as he tried to resist, as much as he tried to cling to the beliefs that had shaped him, he couldn't ignore the pull of what they were offering him. It was a bond, something deeper than he had ever known. And it terrified him. Krogar found himself questioning everything he had been taught. If the Turlak were so superior, so strong, why had they abandoned him? Why had they left him to die when these weaker creatures had risked their lives to save him? The logic didn't add up, and it gnawed at him. He didn't understand these humans, not fully, but he could no longer dismiss them as weak. They had shown him a strength that went beyond physical power, something more enduring. It was a strength that came from unity, from loyalty, from a shared purpose. And slowly, despite himself, Krogar began to feel something he had never felt before, a sense of belonging. It was faint, fragile, like a flicker of light in the darkness, but it was there. For the first time in his life, Krogar wasn't fighting alone. The quiet of the base was shattered when the alarms blared. The Galactic Empire had found them. It wasn't a surprise, not really. The rebels had always known this day would come. They had been living on borrowed time, and now, that time had run out. The small hideout they had built, the one place they had felt safe, was about to become a battleground. Captain Reynolds and his team sprang into action, moving with a grim sense of purpose. There was no panic, just determination. They knew what they were up against, an Empire battalion, heavily armed and fully equipped, sent to wipe them out. The odds were impossibly stacked against them. The rebels had no reinforcements, no backup plan. It was just them, a handful of fighters, standing against the might of the Empire. Krogar watched from the shadows as the humans prepared for what was, by all logic, a suicide mission. They moved with a quiet efficiency, checking weapons, reinforcing barricades, sharing grim nods of acknowledgement. There was no fear in their eyes. Just a resolve that Krogar had never seen before. In his mind, the logical choice was clear. The humans were doomed. The Empire was too strong, and their forces too numerous. In Turlac terms, this battle was over before it even began. And yet, despite the certainty of their defeat, the humans didn't run. They didn't abandon each other. They stood together, even knowing the cost. Krogar had always been taught that the strong survive. His people lived by it. His entire life had been defined by that single, unyielding truth. And yet, as he watched these humans prepare for battle, he saw something different. They weren't fighting for survival alone. They were fighting for each other, for something bigger than just their own lives. It was an alien concept to him, one he had never understood, until now. The sounds of approaching troops echoed through the base. The Empire's forces were closing in. The rebels braced themselves, knowing they were outgunned, outmanned. But even in the face of overwhelming odds, they stood ready, shoulder to shoulder. Krogar felt something stir inside him, something he had tried to ignore since the humans had first saved his life. It was a feeling he didn't know how to name, but it was there, growing stronger with each passing second. As the first shots rang out, the rebels moved with precision. They knew they couldn't win by brute force. They had to be smarter, faster, and more resourceful. But as the Empire's forces stormed their base, it became clear that even their best efforts might not be enough. The rebels were being pushed back, inch by inch, their defenses crumbling under the weight of the assault. Krogar's mind raced. His instincts told him to stay out of it, to let them fight their own battle. He owed them nothing. They had saved him, yes, but that didn't mean he was bound to their cause. He was a warrior, not a rebel. He didn't fight for ideals or loyalty. He fought for strength, for survival. But then, as the battle raged on, Krogar saw something that stopped him cold. Dr. Elena Foster, the woman who had worked tirelessly to heal him, was pinned down by enemy fire. Her usual calm demeanor was cracking as she struggled to hold the line. A blast hit the wall near her, sending her sprawling to the ground. She didn't cry out. She didn't call for help. But Krogar could see it in her eyes, she was out of time. It was in that moment that something inside Krogar shifted. The Turlac would have let her die. They would have considered her weak, useless. But Krogar wasn't Turlac anymore, was he? These humans, they had saved him. They had shown him a strength that went beyond anything his people had ever taught him. It wasn't the strength of the body. It was something deeper, something more powerful. Without thinking, Krogar moved. His body, still not fully healed, roared in protest, but he ignored the pain. He grabbed the nearest weapon, a human-made rifle that felt strange in his hands, and charged into the fray. The sight of him, a towering, four-armed alien, took the Empire's soldiers by surprise. They hadn't expected to face a gladiator in this fight. Krogar's presence on the battlefield was like a force of nature. His size and strength, even diminished, were enough to turn the tide. He tore through the Empire's ranks, using a combination of brute force and the combat skills honed in the arena. The rebels, seeing him fight, were reinvigorated. They rallied around him, pushing back against the Empire's forces with renewed ferocity. But the battle wasn't without cost. The rebels suffered heavy losses. Each life taken was a blow, but they didn't falter. They fought on, even as the odds remained stacked against them. Krogar had never seen anything like it. The humans weren't fighting because they believed they could win. They were fighting because it was the right thing to do. They were fighting for each other. As the dust began to settle, the Empire's forces retreated, unable to break the rebel defenses. It was a victory, but a bitter one. The ground was littered with the bodies of fallen rebels, each loss a stark reminder of the price they had paid. Krogar stood among them, bloodied and bruised, his chest heaving with exhaustion. In that moment, he understood. Strength wasn't just about power or survival. It was about something more. These humans, they had something his people lacked. They fought not just for themselves, but for each other, for their ideals, for something bigger than any one individual. And that, Krogar realized, was real strength. As he looked around at the survivors, at the humans who had risked everything for a cause greater than themselves, Krogar knew his place had changed. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He wasn't just a gladiator fighting for his own survival. He had fought for them, for the humans who had saved him, and in doing so, he had found something he never knew he was missing, a sense of belonging. The aftermath of the battle was a mix of exhaustion and somber relief. The rebels, though victorious, had lost many of their own. The weight of those sacrifices hung heavy in the air as they regrouped, tending to the wounded and gathering what little they had left. The battered walls of their base stood as a testament to their resilience, but also a reminder of how close they had come to being wiped out. Krogar stood off to the side, his massive form silhouetted against the flickering lights of the makeshift base. Blood and grime coated his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing, replaying the chaos of the battle, the choices he had made. He hadn't fought like a gladiator this time. He had fought alongside the humans for them. And now, as the dust settled, he realized that something inside him had fundamentally shifted. The rebels, for their part, no longer looked at him with fear or suspicion. They had seen him fight, seen the lengths he was willing to go to defend them. Captain Reynolds approached him, offering a nod of silent gratitude. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. For the first time, Krogar felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. But still, there was a lingering sense of unease. He had spent his entire life as an outsider, even among his own people. Here, surrounded by humans, that feeling was still there, gnawing at him. As the hours passed, the rebels slowly began to rebuild what they could. There was no time to dwell on their losses. The Empire would return, stronger and more determined to crush them. But for now, they had survived. And in that survival, there was a glimmer of hope. Krogar found himself standing near Dr. Elena Foster. She was bruised, her clothes torn from the fight, but she was alive. She caught his gaze and offered him a tired smile, the same quiet determination in her eyes that he had seen from the very beginning. For a moment they said nothing, just standing in the shared silence of those who had faced death and come out the other side. Then, as if something inside him had finally unlocked, Krogar spoke. "I will fight with you." His voice was low, gravelly, but the conviction was clear. Elena didn't look surprised. She had seen the change in him long before he had fully realized it himself. But still, there was a flicker of relief in her eyes. "Why?" she asked, not challenging him, but wanting to understand. Krogar paused, searching for the words. "I thought strength was the only thing that mattered. That survival meant fighting alone, being the strongest, the fiercest. But your strength," he gestured to the small group of rebels, "it is different. It comes from each other, from loyalty, from caring." The word felt strange on his tongue, as if it didn't belong in his lexicon, but it was the only way he could describe what he had seen in them. My people abandoned me because I was no longer useful. You saved me even when you had no reason to. I owe you my life. And now, I will fight for more than just myself." Captain Reynolds joined them, having overheard the exchange. He studied Krogar for a long moment before extending his hand. "Welcome to the fight, Krogar." Krogar hesitated briefly, then took the captain's hand in a firm grip. It was a symbolic gesture, but to Krogar, it meant more than any oath or battle victory he had ever known. This was an acceptance into something far greater than the gladiatorial arenas where he had earned his reputation. This was a purpose, a cause worth fighting for. In the days that followed, Krogar integrated into the rebel group. At first, it was awkward, the remnants of his old life clashing with the new one he was building. He had always been a warrior, but now he fought for something beyond his own survival. He trained with the rebels, learning their tactics, their way of thinking. They weren't as physically powerful as him, but their strength came from their unity, their shared resolve. It was a strength he had never been taught to value, but now it seemed like the only kind that mattered. The more time Krogar spent with the humans, the more he began to see the depth of their resilience. They fought not just against an oppressive system, but for each other, for the idea of a better future. They weren't motivated by power or glory, but by the hope that they could free the galaxy from tyranny. And slowly, that hope became Krogar's as well. He was no longer just a gladiator, a lone warrior defined by his victories in the arena. He had found a new identity here, among these humans who had shown him a different kind of strength. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore, he was fighting for freedom, for the possibility of a future where no one would be abandoned or cast aside. One evening, as the rebels gathered around a small fire, Krogar found himself standing beside Captain Reynolds, looking out at the night sky. The stars seemed both close and impossibly far, a reminder of how vast the galaxy was and how small their rebellion seemed in comparison. "We're still a long way from winning this war," Reynolds said quietly, as if reading Krogar's thoughts. Krogar nodded. "Yes. But you fight because you believe it can be won." Reynolds glanced at him. "And what about you? What do you believe?" Krogar was silent for a moment, considering the question. "I believe," he said slowly, "that strength comes from more than just power. I believe that together, we are stronger than the Empire. And I believe that I have found something worth fighting for." Reynolds smiled slightly, the kind of smile that carried both hope and the weight of everything they had lost. "Then we keep fighting." Krogar didn't need to respond. The unspoken agreement between them was enough. The road ahead would be long and brutal, filled with battles yet to be fought, sacrifices yet to be made. But for the first time in his life, Krogar wasn't fighting alone. As the night stretched on, Krogar stood with his newfound comrades, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The galaxy was still under the oppressive rule of the Empire, but now there was a spark of rebellion, a chance for something different. And in that moment, Krogar knew that he was no longer just a gladiator. He was part of something bigger, something that could change the fate of the galaxy itself. And he would fight with everything he had to make sure that chance became a reality.